So our goal for the next several classes is going to be to talk about different cycles of matter that are important on our planet. We're calling them Geo Chemical Cycles because of a few things. The reason that the bio prefix is there is because we are going to constantly refer to how living organisms are affected by or play a role by each cycle. Geo means the Earth, so we are talking about how on our planet Earth these things are cycling. And chemical, because we're actually going to talk about a specific substance in each of the cycles. So we are going to talk about the water cycle, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, and then the oxygen and carbon dioxide cycle. So we're going to talk about a bunch of major important chemical substances that play a role in cycles on our planet where living things are part of or are affected by it. Now, each of these cycles involve the cycling of matter. That means actual stuff, atoms, things that you could touch. But these cycles all require energy from the sun as the principal driving force. That means that these cycles would not exist without energy. Even if I had atoms and I had no energy, these cycles couldn't happen. And so the first point that I'd like to make, because we're bridging the gap here between energy, which was chapter 1, and matter, which is chapter 2, is that I have to have both. If I don't have both, there's no way I have equilibrium in the biosphere. Now I'm using the word equilibrium here, but I'm going to make a parallel to something that you all just finished doing. Let's talk about homeostasis. Just like the human organism is trying to keep constant internal conditions, our planet as a whole is trying to maintain constant conditions. And so we're looking for equilibrium, and equilibrium is maintained because of the cycling of energy, like we saw in chapter 1, as well as the cycling of matter, like we'll see in chapter 2. So I put a picture of the sun here on the left because the sun is the main source of energy on our planet. I could add hydrothermal vents here because we know that a fraction of energy is also produced by chemosynthesis. But since the sun is the huge majority, it's the one that we usually focus on the most. And so what we're trying to say is we need energy from the sun because without energy, matter would not cycle. For example, without the sun, think about the water cycle and how water has to constantly evaporate. If there was no heat from the sun heating up our planet, there's no way that would happen. And so for water to keep cycling and to keep transporting things around the planet, we need the energy from the sun. But we also really need decomposers. Decomposers are the things that at the end of a food chain break down materials and return nutrients to the soil. For us to have a place for the energy to do its stuff, we have to have nutrients available to cycle. And so if nothing ever got decomposed, eventually there would be no nutrients for plants. Plants would not be able to do photosynthesis, and the sun's energy would never enter a food chain. So we're trying to get across the idea that you need energy to make things happen, but you also need a place for the energy to go. And a lot of people have the misconception that energy is more important, but it's actually not. If there's nowhere for the energy to go, it's useless. And so you need both things. So sometimes we would refer to this as top down. The sun's way up high, it comes down onto our planet and enters food chains. And a lot of times we would refer to this as bottom up because we're starting at the soil or the ground and then watching nutrients cycle around in a chain. So this is an idea that runs through this whole entire unit. You need energy, but you also need matter. If you don't have both, then life won't exist. Does anyone want to ask any questions about this idea here? So another idea that I want to make sure that you're clear on, because I mentioned it earlier, but I'll mention it again, is that when we're talking about energy and matter, sometimes we refer to the biosphere as an open system, and sometimes we refer to it as closed. The open system is for energy. So if you look, I've illustrated here that solar energy comes into our planet, and eventually, whether it's immediately because it's reflected or after a lot of energy conversions, heat is radiated back out into space. If I'm talking about matter, matter is not coming in and going out. With the small exception of a meteorite, matter is the same as it was billions of years ago. And so I often mention this, like you're probably breathing an oxygen molecule that a super famous person breathed. Your textbook will mention that some of the water that you sweat out when you are exercising or when you're hot might have come from a rainforest. So you have rainforest water running in your veins. Like, it's cool to think about that because the molecules are the same ones that have been around since our planet began. So in terms of matter, it's a closed system. There's basically no new matter that has entered our planet or matter that has left our planet in billions of years. Energy comes in and out all the time, but matter is basically the same, so it has to be recycled to continue the cycle. Does anyone want to ask any questions about that? So this could help you with Chapter 1 quest, because Chapter 1 is about energy, Chapter 2 is about matter. So the first cycle that I want to talk about is the water cycle. And actually, before we talk about the water cycle, I want to talk about what water is for and how you gain and how you lose water. So that you know, water makes up most of the body mass of most living organisms. Now, depending exactly which type of living organism, it could be all of it or it could be less than all of it. Some aquatic things are basically made up all of water. Humans hover somewhere in the 80% range. About 80% of you is water. And it can get as low as about 70 depending on the type of organism and where they live. But the idea we're trying to get across is that over half of the body mass of living things is actually water. It is the major compound in living cells. If I add up all of the things that are in a cell, most of it is water. What do I need water for? Well, I need it for digestion. We know a lot of reasons that you would need water for digestion. For example, we know about hydrolysis, chemical reaction that happens to break macromolecules down into smaller pieces. We also know that water can do something as simple as be part of your saliva and make food easier to swallow. We also know that water is necessary for egestion. If there is not enough water in the feces, you will not be able to egest it. Now, water is also important for transport. Let's think about your blood. Your blood is made up basically half of water, and the part that is water transports a lot of things. It can transport dissolved gases, it can transport waste and nutrients. Water is used for cooling, so think about sweat and think about your blood. Your blood plays a role in helping keep you cool because your blood flow will be redirected to cool you off. And of course, sweat will be produced as well. Water can also be the location where reactions occur, so we can think about catalysts and enzymes and how water can speed things up. So water is necessary for life. There are so many biological things that depend on water, a lot of which we know about from studying those other systems, that water is crucial to living organisms. So I'm going to pause here of me talking about this idea of kangaroo rats. The first thing is, in the example, we're comparing an organism that doesn't really intake a whole bunch of water with one that does. So us, the human, we're the example of an organism that takes in a lot of water. So one of the things I want you to recognize are ways that organisms can gain water. These three are all ways that you can absorb water. In the data tables, it illustrates that when you are eating and when you are drinking, you can absorb water. Now, for other organisms, not necessarily humans, but for other organisms, you can also absorb water through your skin or at the surface. It's not something that we do on an organism level, but it happens in our cells all the time. Water crosses over cell membranes in and out all the time. And so if you think about aquatic organisms, and especially small or unicellular organisms that live in water, direct absorption of water is something that's happening. It doesn't have to be just through food and just through drinking. So you can absorb water. The other thing that it mentions is something called metabolic water. And I said you likely don't know what that is, or at least you don't know that you know what it is. And so I'd like to make sure that you understand what this is. You should write down what metabolic water is. It is a question that I would ask you about. Metabolic water is water that is produced by metabolism. And so we ask ourselves, what is metabolism? Metabolism is the reactions performed by your body to provide energy. And so I drew a picture of a mitochondria because I'd like to remind you of something that you already know. In cell respiration, what happens? Oxygen and glucose make, holy baloney, CO2 and water. So some of the water that you gain is actually coming from a chemical reaction. It's not because you drank the water or it was part of the food that you were eating or you absorbed it. Your body performed a reaction, a metabolic reaction, like cell respiration, and water was a product of that reaction. That is metabolic water. Now the other thing that you have to compare is how you lose water. So over here we have breathing and sweating. Breathing and sweating are both ways that water can leave. In the table, we're talking about evaporation because that's eventually where all of the water would go. So these two fall in the evaporation category. And I want you to not forget that animals are not the only things that lose water. If I was a plant, there is something called transpiration, where water leaves the leaf of a plant through a tiny opening called a stomata. And so plants lose water to transpiration, which is the equivalent of breathing and sweating for a human. The other two ways you lose water are through urine and feces, so your waste products. And so knowing these general ways that you gain and lose water is one thing. Then the questions ask you to compare the percentages. So if I take a look at a kangaroo rat, so we'll do the kangaroo rat in red. A kangaroo rat lives in a really dry environment and it doesn't intake a lot of water. And so any organism that lives in a similar kind of environment, so think of something that lives in a sandy area that doesn't take in much water, it would have, just like an Ord's kangaroo rat, it would have a water budget that's similar to it. So if I was going to ask you about this on a quiz or on a test, I might not use a kangaroo rat, I might use a different organism. Whatever you're doing on there that's making you guys giggle to yourselves, put it away. So I want you to notice that the kangaroo rat has a humongous amount of metabolic water. Compared to the other ways that it could be taking in or acquiring water, the kangaroo rat uses metabolic water as kind of its major way to acquire water. The other thing that I want you to notice about the kangaroo rat is in the water losses section. In the water losses section, it produces very, very little urine or feces. And so it is reducing the amount of waste that it produces so that it doesn't have to use up its water on that. Virtually all of the water that it loses is water that it can't control. It has to breathe. It has to maintain body temperature. And so for the kangaroo rat, this is the major way that it loses water. Now, if we take a look at the human, it's basically the opposite. We get the majority of our water from eating or drinking it, which would make sense because for most of us, water is available and water is part of most of the things that we consume. And we lose basically all of our water through the waste products, through urine and feces. We still lose water, we still have a little amount of this, and we lose our water through breathing and evaporation. So if you take a look, our evaporation number is 800 of the 1900 total, and then urine and feces together are just a little bit more than that. So even though we lose a little bit in our feces, a lot in our urine, it's pretty even for the two of them, where with the kangaroo rat, there's a huge difference. They lose a ton of water to evaporation and only a little tiny bit of water to the urine and to the feces. And so it would be realistic for me to ask you on a quiz or on a test, hey, here's a water budget. Which organism does this water budget go with? And I would specifically ask you about metabolic water. So you have to know what it is, where it comes from. Since we already talked about cellular respiration, I could even ask you about cellular respiration directly if I was going to ask you a question here.